Well, it's great to see you all here. And Kevin, it's a great pleasure to do this with you and sort of share thoughts about our odysseys through this interesting relationship with China. I must say that your book, which we are here to celebrate tonight, Not for the Faint-Hearted, I must say I felt a little faint of heart when I first saw the book at almost 700 pages, but once I got into it, I really did begin to enjoy it.
And just an American weakling, mate. It's only that thick.
It's only that thick. It's I think, very apropos, of course, to what we're going to be talking about tonight. So, Kevin, I think the first question that sort of occurs to me, I mean, clearly, Kevin and I are two people who couldn't be less Asian, and yet here we are. We've spent our lives sort of involved in this very interesting, sometimes vexing country, China. So let's start with just sort of talking about how we each sort of fell into this proposition. And your beginning of your book, you do discuss that. So what would you say was the catalytic agent that got you going?
I think the honest answer to your question, Orville, is families matter, and your families influence you in a very deep way. And the person who influenced me most was my mother. My mother had never been to high school, but she was, like my father, self-educated. Mm-hmm. And because they were the wartime generation, they had an instinctive interest in the world, and they just read about things. And so my mother started feeding me books, and politically conservative, but she had a interest in what was happening in Asia. And if you're a kid growing up in rural Australia, you all knew the history of the World War, the Second World War. You all knew that things were looking dark and dire at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the invasion across the countries of Southeast Asia. And then the Yanks arrived, okay? That's your lot. And then we were in it together. And then suddenly it got to the end of the Second World War in Australia, and the then Australian Labor government said, you know something? We finally worked out that the British don't understand Asia for us. Look what happened with the fall of Singapore. And then there began a movement, I think, in Australia across political circles to develop our own independent understanding of the countries of the region. And that's when, for example, my university, the Australian National University, was born. And so my mum had nothing to do with any of that, except that she was just a foot soldier. She was a nurse during the war, and my father was a member of the Australian military. And so because of that background, though, she began feeding me books and explaining to me that you need to understand what's happening in the world and what's happening in Asia. And so for me, the big, I think, memory from childhood, and I think I refer to it in the book, is on the day that China was finally admitted to the United Nations. I remember as a 13-year-old, she walks into my room, hands me the copy of the newspaper that day and says, read this, this will change your life. And then walked out. And she was a nurse, right? And so as a 13-year-old, I more or less still did what my mother asked me to do, but not often. And so I started reading, and that just grew into an adolescent fascination with what was going on in Asia generally, but China in particular. And by the time I finished high school, I couldn't think of anything else that I really wanted to do. Do you go off and be a lawyer and study at university and do that? Or do you try and understand the language of this extraordinary culture and civilization called China? So I took the leap. Mm-hmm. So I think I put it down to my mother's influence. I'd never met anyone from China, by the way, at that stage. Rural Australia, country town, 160 people. When I went to high school, there was one Chinese restaurant in the town, and it served what you called Australian and Chinese food. Emphasis on the Australian, actually. It was that bad. And so it was largely, therefore, from books and the encouragement of my mum. Mm-hmm. What about you, my friend?
You know, it's sometimes it's the most sort of inconsequential things that throw the switch and get you moved off in a certain direction. I think for me that it was the sheer impossibility of getting there, which Australia didn't share quite as completely as America did, because we simply could not go to China. So it was that sort of fascination, which I think Americans have for places like Tibet, that whole exploration in the end of the last century of getting to some place where you really weren't wanted and where it was very difficult to ever get to. My grandfather, interestingly enough, was a doctor, and he went to China in 1907 with Yale in China, and my father was almost born there. So we had around our house sort of few things. I still have a check my grandmother got made there in 1906. So there were these sort of little objects that kind of created a fascination for this place, which I ultimately couldn't get to. And then in college, I stumbled into this course, and I began to work in the Harvard Yenching Library and see all these books that I couldn't read. And it seemed very fantastic. And at that age...
When you said you stumbled into the course, how did you stumble into it?
It was one of those things, as I said, that was utterly accidental. My sister was there too. And we wanted to take a course together, and it was the only course, this epic course on China and Japan, taught by Edwin Reischauer and John Fairbank. I had no idea what I was getting into. But by the end of it, not knowing what else to do with myself, I just went on. And then
our texts at university are all by Reischauer and Fairbank, and so so their writings on East Asian civilizations and East Asia, the modern transformation. I mean, these things were deeply informative of my early views of the place. You could actually just sit at the feet of the oracle. We were 12,000 miles away.
But when you're sitting at the feet of an oracle, you don't realize it's an oracle. It's just another lecture. But indeed, I look back on it, and I realize it was a kind of a real moment of sort of sinology when we were all looking through this glass darkly, trying to see what was going on, and it was very difficult to do that. Now, I remember Australians who actually could go there. So you weren't quite a shutout.
We put most of them in jail afterwards, but
yeah. But when did Australia actually first recognize China?
Well, it's an interesting old story. The Australian Labor government was in office during the 1940s, and after the October Revolution in 1949, we were about to go into Australian general elections. The then Labor government made preparations to recognise Beijing. We lost the election that year. When I say we, I mean my party lost the election. And so as a result, it was another 23 years, because we were out of office then throughout the whole, let's call it McCarthyite period, and its Australian reflections, which was that anyone who had anything to do with political association with communist China was as bad as communist Russia, and as a result, it was effectively used by the conservative parties in Australia to keep folks like us out of office. So we didn't recognise until 1972. So it was quite...
Was that before Nixon and Kissinger or after?
In fact, we were in China just before Kissinger. Mm-hmm. And but that was when the leader of our party then, a guy called Edward Gough Whitlam, actually went to China, would you believe it, as leader of the opposition, and then came home to Australia in deeply conservative circumstances, and part of his campaign was we had to recognise his country. It was just nuts. And so that's how our relationship with the PRC began. Prior to that, there'd been the usual set of trade union-based connections with the Chinese, partly affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, and some of them fellow travellers. A lot of romanticists were attached to the mythology of the Cultural Revolution and thought it was a wonderful thing when it was just one giant bloodbath. But at a political level, it really didn't kick off until the early 70s.
So did you, Kevin, have any fascination with the revolution as an alternative way of doing things and fall under the spell of any of that sort of early, in the 60s, the infatuation with, you saw it with Mao, you saw it in France with, various films that were made about China in this country? Or did you escape that?
Yeah, I think I was just not quite old enough. I remember once at a high school where I was just sick and tired of overall political conformity, tracking down a copy of Mao's Little Red Book and then waving it around in the classroom one day just to irritate the teacher. It had the desired effect. Did I understand anything about what was in Mao's Little Red Book? Not a zot. And certainly when I landed at university in 76, which was a momentous year in Chinese history. Mao died, Zhou Enlai had died earlier that year, and the Gang of Four fell. And Chinese politics was changed that year. So as a first-year university student, trying to make sense of all that was virtually impossible.
Yeah.
And then the academy, as may have happened here in the United States, our teaching faculty were divided between those who were kind of pro-Mao and those who were deeply opposed to everything that they'd seen with the politics of the Cultural Revolution. So academia was divided right down the middle, at least at the Australian National University and elsewhere as well. You would know one of my teachers, Pierre Ryckmans.
I mean, this was an amazing man, a true scholar.
And so you spoke before about sitting at the feet of an oracle. And when you're sitting at the feet of an oracle, you don't understand that you're sitting at the feet of an oracle. For those of you who don't know this man, he died only a few years ago. He's probably one of the most brilliant all-round sinologists of the post-war period. His name was Pierre Ryckmans. He was a Belgian-Australian, wrote under the pseudonym of Simon Leys, and wrote the first Western polemics against what was happening with the appalling totalitarian excesses of the Cultural Revolution. He wrote, for example, books called The Emperor Has No Clothes, and then
Chinese Shadows.
And then Chinese Shadows. And so he was our Chinese teacher, and this remarkable scholar with a formidable knowledge of Chinese aesthetics and the tradition, an extraordinary knowledge of Chinese classical painting and calligraphy. He would be there in Canberra, Australia, in the middle of nowhere, teaching this bunch of country bumpkins like me about Chinese aesthetics. But you had no idea that you were sitting at one of the great authorities in the field. And he had a profound effect on me.
So an interesting question is this. We grew up at a time that was very anti-communist. And Pierre Ryckmans, Simon Leys was certainly at the head of that list. So how did we get to the place where we have Nixon and Kissinger going to China, we reconcile with China in certain ways, and we all go on trying to build this sort of this conceit of engagement. How do you square that with your sort of interior beliefs? And you're a religious person, you believe in the dignity of the individual, you believe in all of these things, and yet here we are spending our lives trying to work things out with a country that is very different.
Orville would describe that as a simple question. There's about 10 embedded questions in that.
Yes, it's big.
Let me try and make sense of how China evolved post-72 and then my own reflections on it, if you like. And so why did you guys finally decide to jump on the China bandwagon? It had nothing to do with your view that Chinese communism was changing. For God's sake, in 1971-72, we were just out of Lin Biao. We were still criticizing Lin Biao and Confucius in China, and the Gang of Four was running rampant. And so America's decision to recognize, and the whole strategic logic of Kissingerian diplomacy was geopolitical. There was an opening, and it all began, of course, with the Sino-Soviet split. It began with the problems that had arisen across the border between the Soviets and the Chinese. They finally worked out with the Chinese assault on a Soviet revisionism. that there was a wedge to be exploited, and to place enormous geopolitical pressure and geostrategic pressure on the Soviets. Kissinger intelligently saw a massive opening, and he had the extraordinary chutzpah to lead the United States into that opportunity. Others, like Nick Platt, who's with us this evening, who was party to all of this at the time, will have a more nuanced view than mine. But I think the geopolitics of the American decision at the time was right. And in its own way, if you look at it in the grand sweep of history, it was one of those straws that ultimately broke the camel's back in terms of the collapse of Soviet communism 20 years later. So then you had the infatuation, not with Mao in this country, but with the promise which Deng Xiaoping's China offered America, which was of an entirely different sort. With Deng Xiaoping's China, you saw the possibility of China one day becoming like America. You saw the beginnings of reform and opening. You saw Deng Xiaoping wearing the Stetson when he went down to the rodeo, wherever it was, during his famous visit to the United States in 1979. And so, thank you, Nick. You were there, obviously.
I was in that rodeo arena.
You were on the horse?
No, I wasn't on the horse, but watching that amazing moment where some of you may not remember, Deng Xiaoping emerged. He was sitting in the front row of the arena, and a beautiful young woman on a quarter horse rode up and clapped a 10-gallon hat over his head. And then he emerged 10 minutes later out of the place where the bulls usually come out in a Wells Fargo stagecoach, waving like a beauty queen at the crowd. I mean, this was high theater. And that Deng Xiaoping really understood what he was doing, which was sending a message to Chinese, one kind of message. It's okay to consort with Americans. And he was sending a message to the Americans that it's all right to get together with Chinese. It was a brilliant moment of theater. But look, don't continue.
There's 25 or 30 years of solid Chinese diet of American colonialism and imperialism. And suddenly you had this guy running around on a stagecoach with a Stetson. So this began phase 2 of the American, I think, infatuation with China in the modern period, which is you saw in this guy, with reform and opening, the possibility that this emerging socialism with Chinese characteristics may in fact be transitioning to something which was much more compatible with an American liberal capitalist view of the future of the world. And I think that optimism stayed in the American experience at least through until '89, and went through fits and starts there afterwards until we've arrived at the current period. What has been my sort of underpinning view of all these things? I think in two areas, Orville. One is, as a student of civilizations, you cannot but be awed by the continuity and the complexity and the depth of Chinese classical civilization. Mm-hmm. And so the more you read, and the more you reflect, and the more you absorb, the more it actually causes you to feel humble about your own civilizational tradition. I'm a deep Occidentalist. I'm a product of the Judeo-Christian West. That's me. But I have enough of an empirical mind to know that when you see civilizational depth and complexity, that these are not accidents of history. It's because quite profound cultures have caused them to evolve that way. So that's in one part of the cerebral cortex. And the other part of the cerebral cortex is a part of me which has always found deeply problematic, in the modern period in particular, authoritarianism or totalitarianism. And seeing what has happened in various periods of history when it's had its sway. And Mao, when taken at the full, both from the Great Leap Forward through the Cultural Revolution, in fact back to the anti-rightist movement of 1958, really from 58 through to 78, this was an ugly period where so many innocent people lost their lives in China. And so for me, I found that deeply, deeply ethically challenging. And my university thesis was on one of the first activists in the Chinese democracy movement, Wei Jingsheng.
So, I think if we, in a certain sense, came of age intellectually during the period of engagement, I mean, implicit in that was the notion that sort of history is going in a certain direction, and that if we engage in different ways, through business, through culture, through academic exchanges, et cetera, slowly the lines would converge. And I think the 80s, that was a very logical, plausible set of suppositions to make. It wasn't pure folly. I think, as you just said, Kevin, 1989 sort of put a stake through the heart of that in some sense. But then Jiang Zemin brought it back again, quite extraordinarily. Now, the question that I don't have an answer for, that I'd like to throw out here, is, are we now at the end of the time when we can rationally, reasonably make the supposition that engagement is still sort of, history is moving towards that convergence, or are we now at a time when we're starting to diverge?
Orville always asks the easy questions. A thought on the end of history as defined by us and as defined by them, let's call it the West and the East, for horrible, simplified reasons. We all know the cliche of the end of history, Fukuyama, and the great complacency which I believe it represented, which is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of history had come, the final triumph of liberal capitalism, everything else was a matter of detail. And the only cause for complexity was what evolved in the 90s, which was, oops, now that we've finished an ideological war, there's going to be a whole bunch of regional ethnic wars, aka the Balkans. Therefore, as long as we keep those under control, however, and manage them, the general trend of history, that the arc of history is bending in a liberal capitalist direction. And in our optimism, I think in the 80s, though I was never quite there in the optimistic stakes, maybe I'd spent too long in the embassy in Beijing in the 80s to feel completely optimistic about it.
It was as optimistic as anyone was going to get that period.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I was also in Beijing in 89, in May and early June. I wasn't there on June 4. And so that then ran into this enormous brick wall where the decisions then, 29 years ago, were decisive about which way the regime wished to go. And so, following that, as you then said, you had two major developments. Come 92, Deng Xiaoping, who had given the ultimate green light to the crackdown of 89, then travelled south to Shenzhen and his famous Nanxun and his southern expedition, and said, we need to go faster and harder on reform. Well, that confused everybody. Because we had this massive crackdown in Beijing, that was the end of that. And what was he meaning, go faster and harder on reform? Well, in fact, what he meant was we'll have more perestroika, but maybe a little less glasnost. We'll have a fair bit more opening to the Western world. We might not have as much, as it were, reform on the political side. And then that flowed through, I think, through the Jiang Zemin period. And I think by the time you get to the late 90s, and I'm interested in your views on this, there's this massive internal debate in the party, secret debate, about is the game up? That is, are we going to face the end of history exactly as Fukuyama's predicted? We managed to survive as a regime through the events of 89. Do we now need to think about the long-term transformation of the Chinese Communist Party into a form of social democratic party, maybe with Singaporean characteristics, rather than submit ourselves to a violent revolution at some stage? And then the period 98 to 2001, there's a big internal debate about this. But they resolve that no, they can actually create their own history, and that it won't be the end of history as defined by the West. And so what's the end of history defined by Xi Jinping? I think Xi Jinping's conclusion, coming out of the events of that internal party debate, which preceded him, really, because it was resolved at the end of the Jiang Zemin period in about 2001. Xi Jinping's view is that we, the authoritarian party, can hang on. And our end of history is in fact a form of authoritarian or state capitalism. And a different end of history for us is grafting on a new level of civilizational greatness around, let's call it, the global standing of Greater China. If I was trying to summarize, the Xi Jinping dream. To end that little reflection, of course, the internal debate within China still is Xi Jinping's view of the end of history so described, which is the party still in control, a state capitalist system, reasonable levels of wealth, some level of personal freedom, no political freedom, and with a continued control of the economy still through significant state-owned enterprises? Is there a counter voice to that? And I think there is. So on your question is what is the end of history, I don't think it's ours. I don't necessarily think it's theirs at this stage as either. There's still, however, a deep impulse towards what we would broadly describe as freedom.
Yes, I mean, if one believes, as I think I do, and probably many of you do, there is an irrepressible instinct within human beings to be more free rather than less free. I think I would agree with you, Kevin. I think what's so interesting about China and makes it so difficult to figure out is that we've seen it in opposite guises and different occasions, where it kind of, that bespeaks of a society that's deeply unresolved in terms of what it aspires to be in its identity. Now, when I first went to China in 1975, I went on a youth work delegation, and we worked in a
Sounds very ideologically suspect
well,
to me.
I was, I did get in a bit of trouble, I must admit, for it not being ideologically pure enough.
How surprising for you all.
That was the area when we had to sit every night in meetings to criticize Confucius and criticize Lin Biao. And of course, Confucius was Zhou Enlai, to criticize him as a pragmatist. But at that time, you could not have detected a single scintilla of evidence of anything that was to come.
That's correct.
And it did come with a vengeance. When Mao died, the Gang of Four was arrested, and Deng Xiaoping suddenly arises as if out of nowhere, cashiered twice before, and he launches a counter-revolution. Now, so we thought, okay, now we see this other side of China's personality. History is kind of moving in a different direction. Then we had 1989, it snapped back again. So, and now we have Xi Jinping, and we see a very different version, more of a version that's more confident in its own unique kind of an authoritarian impulse. So I think where you ended, Kevin, is right. We've seen sort of different periods where China's oscillated from one personality, sort of a bipolar situation, and it's seeking to find some new angle of repose, some new basis, and it keeps kind of lurching towards the end of the spectrum, and it is yet to find some comfortable place in the middle, which I wager at some point will combine elements both of East and West.
I think the interesting reflection about Xi Jinping's view of all this is that the more I've read about what the guy thinks, and the more I have spoken to people who know him, and based on my own limited conversations with him, Xi by training is a Marxist dialectician. You and I have had this chat privately. And we need to think about that. When was the last time we had a discussion here at the Asia Society about Marxist dialectics? Probably quite some time. But what do we mean by a dialectician in a Marxist sense? It's that as an intellectual discipline, Xi Jinping is trained to look at social and economic forces pushing in one direction, what reaction or contradiction, to use the Chinese term 矛盾, will arise in response to that, and what in turn can I do to deal with that reaction by way of my own response. In Hegelian terms, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the more I look at the way in which this guy's thinking is reflected, the more I'm convinced that that is a lot to do with his intellectual software and the system around him as well. So why do I say all that? It's not just an arid academic seminar. I think what happens is that he too is looking at the whole question of end of history. He and those around him are fascinated by Western history, fascinated by their own history, in which they're much more deeply steeped, but therefore very much conscious of the forces alive in their culture and in their society and their economy today, which are pushing China in what you and I would describe as a more liberal direction. What are those things? A whole bunch of private firms who, frankly, generate every new job in China and have done so for years, and creating their own, let's call it new entrepreneurial class. You also have a whole bunch of people who now travel and study in the world, who come back with a range of impressions from the world. You now have means of information dissemination, which, despite the best efforts of an authoritarian state, still filter through. Mm-hmm. And so all these things are known, that these create certain impulses to what we would describe the enhancement of human freedom. But if you're running an authoritarian state, then what he will say is, well, the best way to deal with this, in fact, is to have a clamp on the overall extent to which the private sector can grow. Hence, I see a resurgence of China's fascination with the continued role of state-owned enterprises. And then what he's also saying, I think, is that per courtesy of the new technologies, and the new information technologies and the new surveillance technologies, we now have unprecedented means by which to control people, or at least monitor them, if not control. You've seen them applied most acutely in Xinjiang, up in the northwest. And so what I see is a very active and alert apparatus, mindful of where the pushback needs to occur. Look at the new emphasis on ideology. Look at the new emphasis in propaganda. Look at the new sophistication in Chinese, let's call it mass entertainment. Look at Chinese game shows. These are politically inoffensive but massively entertaining things which keep people amused. And they know that most Chinese people don't give a damn about politics. They just want to have a nice life. You know, a lot of people are like that. Want to go to one of Hal Newman's shows down in Broadway. You know, it's a much better way to be. And so these are very smart dialecticians who've worked out the other side of the equation. So where does this ultimately shake down?
But so that's the interesting question, because, I mean, if you take the view that I described a moment ago, that China tries this on, something changes, then it tries this suit of clothes on, something changes, then it tries a different suit of clothes on, you have to assume that what we see now is not steady, solid state. In other words, it is one period and it will change. And we have never seen any of the major inflection points coming. We only ex post facto can explain them, but we've never predicted them. We've never seen the future incipient in the present. It's just suddenly happened and surprised us.
I don't know, speak for yourself, Orville. I predicted every one of them. So it was a joke, okay? Unlike Orville, we missed most of the evidence.
But I mean, this does wouldn't you say, Prime Minister Rudd, that this does belie our ability as China experts to have a tremendously oracular power in terms of foreseeing the future?
Yes, is the humble answer from that of anyone who has any interest in history. Let me give you an example of ignorance on my part, is trying to understand, as a diplomat in China through the mid-80s, and knowing truckloads of people, including some of those who subsequently became involved in the student movement of '89. There's not a single cablegram from me in the embassy back to Canberra in those days which would have predicted anything like the events of '89. Yeah. And with 2020 hindsight, you can pick up the entrails of things that you should have perhaps joined the dots with, only to realise that with any fair reflection, it was impossible to join those dots at the time. So what can you do as a sinologist, and why do people bother listening to us as a consequence? It's a fair question. I think all we can do is reflecting on this civilization and the culture and its contemporary government, is to point to the forces that are at work.
Yes.
And to give clarity around what those forces at work are, which are indigenous to the tradition and which are new to the tradition. And to point to what I would best describe as credible scenarios for the future. And still have about us a level of optimism about what China could become, even though there is a new authoritarianism, which I've reflected on in recent speeches when I gave at West Point recently, which I think give us cause for pause.
So do you, how do you respond to the notion that sort of China has, without intentionally meaning to, kind of pioneered a whole new and quite successful, we have to say, way of being in the world, of developing, of managing its society, of projecting itself out on a global scale? When people come to you and say, boy, it looks pretty good to me, what's your response?
Well, China's great strength is simultaneously its great weakness. There is what we've just described, which is China's national zuofa, its method of doing things, is in fact a product of its authoritarian system and to some extent its culture. It's fu shu ting ming, bow your head and listen to the words of the emperor. And so as a result, you can say one day, as the leader of the country, we're going to have something called Belt and Road. Okay, everyone got that? We're going to have Belt and Road. And so about 2 million bureaucrats go to work, and then 4 years later you'll have a national conference on Belt and Road. You'll announce it to the world. 4,000 delegations will go out to the world. They'll come back, they'll fact find, they'll go back again, they'll start doing stuff. It'll be funded, it'll be partly successful, and partly won't be. But that is a product of the culture and the contemporary system, which is its politics. But the weakness side of it is that the same culture and the same political structure has given China some enormous inherent political instability in the events that we've seen in China since since the events of 1966. The number of times China has had easy and smooth transitions in its political leadership in that period of time is relatively small.
Two.
And if you look at what has happened in the events of 2012-13, when Xi Jinping's leadership transition came about, only taking the Chinese account of what occurred in the events of 12 and 13, this was not a smooth transition. There was considerable resistance. And so you've seen quite a number of leading political personalities who were on the other side of the politics of the country, not just Bo Xilai, but others, who've been put into the slammer ever since, ostensibly on corruption grounds, but underneath it, with many of them, for political reasons as well. So what's to answer your question about, here is the China model, and the cliche is true. We walk down the streets of New York, the streets are never properly paved, the garbage isn't picked up, the metro doesn't work. If only the Chinese would come here and fix it, it'll all be fine, because they know how to do this stuff. Yes, but they don't really have a tradition of smooth and peaceful leadership transition either. And whether you voted for President Trump, and I'm sure a majority in this room have, maybe, then the bottom line is the constitutional process of this country actually worked. And there was a smooth transition to power. It was a very nice ceremony at the White House. Huge ceremony, in fact. But it all worked. So, you know, the swings and roundabouts are, yes, authoritarian systems can be enormously efficient in getting things done, but the inherent rigidities are there. Elections, democratic elections, are effectively the automatic stabilizers of our system of government and economics, which is ultimately you can throw the bums out peacefully. In an authoritarian system, you can't.
So this raises an interesting question that I think everybody who deals with China has to wrestle with, and that is the sort of asymmetry between the reality of what we see there and those that, you know, are very often contravened by what goes on in China. And this raises, particularly for people, and we've talked about this often, Kevin, you know, people like you as a political figure, me as a public figure and a writer. How do we square that? And what do we say and what do we not say when we find that kind of collision between deeply held beliefs and a reality of someone else's country, which from some point of view, we probably should have no right to say anything about?
Well, therein lies the challenge of politics and diplomacy, period, not just in relation to the Middle Kingdom. Someone said to me recently, a well-known American general said to me recently, why is it that you China guys have to be so goddamn polite about China all the time? Even when Orville and I are fairly frank in our remarks, actually, and my speech making and his can from time to time be quite colourful about what we see is going right and wrong in China. My response to the good general was, we apply exactly the same level of candour that you do in your public remarks in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In fact, more. And the Middle East, or countries which diplomatic or politically you may not wish to egregiously offend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So what we know from the world of diplomacy and the world of politics is that this is always a contest between how much do you say candidly in your public speech making, how much do you reserve privately in your private engagement with officials and diplomats and politicians from the country concerned, and the judgment of knowing what to say when. You've been through that, I've been through that, and there's no magic to how you do it effectively on each occasion. What I try to do in my own engagement with China is to be as frank as I can publicly, and if people are interested in frankness, the speech I gave recently at West Point, which is up on our Asia Society website, is my attempt to define as candidly as I can Xi Jinping's worldview, from the party, through the state, out to the region, and on to the United States, and through to the United Nations, from go to woe. It's fairly sharp. Do I engage in gratuitous attacks on Chinese political leaders or personalities? No, I choose not to. But I don't think you do either.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think for me, there is something, and I'd be curious to hear your reaction, there is something very distinctive about the way China reacts to criticism, and has deep historical roots in the question of respect, and we've discussed this too. But how would you characterize that sort of unique Chinese sensitivity towards having other people, even if they're essentially friendly, be critical, even one might say honest?
Well, I've been through this debate at a conceptual level with the Chinese. You will recall when I was Prime Minister, I went to China for the first time and gave a lecture in Chinese at Peking University.
I think they've never forgotten that either.
The speech was Future of Australia-China Relations, but I began with some fundamental principles, which is, what does it mean to be a friend? Those of you who speak Chinese in the room know that the classical Chinese term for friend is 朋友, 老朋友, old friend, okay? And your discovery of China is that by the time you visited there once, you've already become a 老朋友. And you become to the point where the term no longer means a whole lot. So in the speech that I gave, I said, yes, there's a whole lot of 朋友话, a whole lot of speaking about friendship. But in the classical tradition, there's another term for friendship, which is called 正友. And the term 正友, which is much less used, means a friend who is your friend, who respects you as a person, but is also prepared to be candid with you when you disagree, and where you think that they're taking the wrong path, and you accept that in a reciprocal way as well. So I expounded in my first visit to China in Chinese at Peking University the concept of 正友. I'm not sure it was entirely positively received, but...
Well, I think you said a few other things, if recollection serves, that about rights and whatnot that...
I did mention the word Tibet a few times in the speech. Did the Chinese government like that? No. But did I have a responsibility as the Prime Minister of a democracy in Asia to say that? Yes, I believe I did, because I've been true to my own tradition. Did I spend 100% of my speech on it? No. I would have spent about 3% of my speech on it. But it was important to register politely, clearly, where differences of values and conceptual frameworks lie in their origins. And then you go on to the question of, well, given that reality and given that you don't necessarily share all those values, how do we deal with difference and disagreement in the future, and what are our common interests? That's what I was seeking to outline. And I gave the speech on 正友again recently in Shanghai, and it was interesting, the response these days. The original speech is still well remembered.
So do you think it's gotten harder to speak as a Zhengyao, as a sort of friendly critic in the last 5 years?
The danger for the West, if you believe in the idea of the West, which I do, because I'm a creature of the West. I mean, we spent our entire careers on the East, but I'm a creature of the West. That's just who I am. If you regard rural Queensland, Australia as the West, it's kind of just different down there. It's a bit like saying you're from Western civilization, I'm from Oklahoma. So sorry if there's anyone here from Okie. But the real danger is that when people from the West start apologizing for their own tradition, the real danger for the West is when you begin self-censoring yourself in terms of what you believe to be your inherent core set of values. And so I think the important thing with our Chinese friends is to find always the balance, which is, this is who we are, this is what we believe in, this is why I believe it, these are our interests, this is how we're choosing to prosecute them. I know that some of those don't intersect with yours, and here are the ones that do. As soon as you start leaving the first bit of the equation out of the exchange, you're engaging in a level or other of self-censorship. And I think it's self-censorship on the part of the West which is not useful. The balance lies in this, and you know this really well, my friend, which is if you go too far, then your opportunity to then have even more candid conversations privately with our Chinese interlocutors disappears because you're locked out altogether. And so what do you do in forging that balance? No one knows. I've just had a life of trying to find the medium point, my own zhongyong, my own golden mean. Maybe I have, maybe I haven't.
I mean, this is exactly what makes China so interesting. And I see Danny grinning here, Danny Russell, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. He had to walk that tightrope too. And this is a uniquely Chinese tightrope. Would you not agree, Kevin, that we don't have such a tightrope like with Canada? There are other issues,
well, I think
of course.
that's probably an unfair polarity.
Well, it is. Let's just say China does have its unique its Chinese characteristics.
Well, I've spent a lot of time dealing with India as Prime Minister of Australia. If I was to having large public conversations about what I believe to be difficulties in the Indian political model, the political class's treatment of caste, etc., and do that in an official capacity, then I've got to say there are sensitivities there as well. Let's be honest about that. And certainly in the Arab world. And I have to say, we Australians are very familiar with dealing with the largest Muslim country in the world. It's next door to us. It's called Indonesia. And so as a result, it's not quite as unique a phenomenon that you reflect. Perhaps we see it with slightly different eyes because we are a country in Australia, 25 million Westerners by and large, in a country which is in Asia, where all of our neighbours, frankly, are of vastly different civilizational traditions. We have the Malay cultures of Southeast Asia, the Malay Islamic cultures of Indonesia. We have our own experience of Japan, we have India, and we have China, and we have everything else in between. And the sensitivities, for example, if I was to opine today on the state of what I think about Thai politics, I'm not sure that it would be entirely welcome either. So we have a different prism by which we see this complexity all around us. You see the big guys, which is China, only because, frankly, they're your nearest global competitor. And I understand that. So I don't disagree with your analysis about Chinese sensitivities, but what I'm saying is, an Australian, I've encountered those a lot in many parts of the world. I was attacked most viciously once by the governor of Louisiana, actually, when I dared to suggest that racism might still be alive in Louisiana. That was a mistake.
Now,
I offended the sensitivities of the American people.
Before we get to questions from you all, let me just pose one final. Do you think we are possibly entering a period which could be described in some way as a clash of civilizations where the old hope of engagement has really run aground?
I think when we conclude that engagement is dead, we're almost concluding that conflict and war is the next step. So, as a student of organizational history myself, I could never reach that point. However complex the challenges may be, it's not just Churchillian pragmatism that it's always better to jaw than to war. It's also a deeper view that in any of these civilizational and cultural traditions, there are multiple elements at work. We said before that China's definition of its own end of history is internally contested. That being the case, and I think we have a continued responsibility to engage. I don't see the point in saying it's an end to engagement. And the second part of what I'd say is, however, we must be simultaneously vigilant about where authoritarianism goes in the future, of whichever form and shape in the world. And therefore, we must always be alert to the patterns of history. I read recently, in part at least, the book by on the Dangers of Fascism from former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And Madeleine's reflecting on Europe there. And she's talking in particular about what's unfolding in Eastern Europe at the time, at the present. And she's bringing to bear sort of historical lenses and people being somewhat jarred who've been around a bit, as Madeleine has, when they start to see some of the old cadences re-emerging. So I think it's really important on the vigilance side of the equation for us also to have a very sober mind applied to things like the military, things like activities around the world by states, including by China, so that we exercise appropriate, robust, in our case, Western responses. Let me conclude on this in my formal remarks, and we'll throw it open, is I do worry, both in this country and in my own, about any emergence of a new McCarthyism, about a discussion of how we handle China. It becomes easier and easier in my country, Australia, though I'm not living there at the moment, to see the country starting to polarize, that you're either pro-China or anti-China. Now, I hadn't seen that for a long, long time. Like, I can barely remember that being the case as a kid growing up. I worry that when that happens, you start to force people in the domestic politics of our countries to jump into one camp or another, and I'm doubly concerned about the impact which that has on the Chinese diaspora, frankly, in my country and here. Because then questions implicitly begin to be asked about whether people are patriotic Australians or patriotic Americans, if they're of a different ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And I have real qualms about that. So let us have about us what I describe as an appropriate national civility and intellectual maturity to countenance hard and complex debates about China's rise, America's future, our role as an American ally and a friend of China, without throwing people into two camps. You start doing that, I think we start to infect our own democracies in an unhealthy way.
I mean, I think maybe it's fair to say that if, in fact, the old version of engagement is over because history is not ineluctably moving in a certain direction, we still may need a post-engagement policy of engagement. But it may be one stripped of some of the naivete and the presumptiveness of, everything's on our side. We know where history is going. But we shouldn't also forget, Kevin, that the Chinese, too, had their version of Hegel. Marx. They believed history had an inescapable direction. So it wasn't just us who were suckered into a Hegelian view of things getting better and better and more open.
I think that's true. What I meant before by yes to engagement was in fact what you said, which is the counterpoint is vigilance. And I think it's not beyond our wit and wisdom as cultures and political systems to maintain these two thoughts simultaneously within one cerebral cortex. I think intelligent polities like this one and ours should be able to do that. If we start defaulting into an us versus them, I think we end up into quite a difficult and I think unproductive set of circumstances. On the vigilance side of the equation, I'll turn this into a personal example. In office as a Chinese-speaking Prime Minister of a Western country, probably the first in the world, I was routinely attacked for being too hard on the Chinese. I announced our plans to double the Australian submarine fleet, increase the surface fleet by a third, because of changes in the strategic behaviour of the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy in the South China Sea. I did that, routinely attacked for being anti-Chinese as a result, and most particularly in various elements of the Chinese press, including Global Times. I also blocked, I remember, a Chinese attempted acquisition of one of our largest resource firms. I also engaged the Chinese publicly on the treatment of various Chinese Australians who'd been incarcerated at the time for, convictions under Chinese domestic law, defending their basic legal rights as I would define them. Yet I pick up today's newspaper in Australia, and I've got some academic I've never heard of attacking me for being pro-Chinese because of what, I don't know. Presumably I speak Chinese. But because I sense back home there's now this polarised debate which has only got room to put people in two boxes. This is really dangerous when that sort of thing happens. It doesn't enable complexity to be dealt with, and dealt with in a sophisticated way. And complexity is not simply a synonym for inertia in response to changing strategic circumstances. It just recognises that you need complex responses, not simple sound bites which says, I'm pro-Chinese, I'm anti-Chinese, China's bad, China's good, China's evil, China's wonderful. I mean, China's bloody complex.
And I think it also requires a rather more sophisticated understanding on behalf of the Chinese government that to get along, it is very dangerous to presume, for instance, that all people in the Chinese diaspora are somehow sons of the daughters of the Yellow Emperor. I mean, I think that, in fairness, must also be said that both sides play a very critical role in any sort of fall into this.
I agree with you. When I was before I was Prime Minister, we had a visit by Jiang Zemin to Australia, and Jiang Zemin brought in the leaders of the Australian Chinese community and said that, remember, first and foremost, you're sons and daughters of the Yellow Emperor, China's mythical founding feature. To which one of the Australian Chinese said, because he didn't speak Chinese, said, no, mate, I'm an Australian. And I think that was just very culturally confronting for President Jiang Zemin. So you're right. I mean, it's a bit of a try-on on the part of Chinese leaders to go out to 60 million Chinese who live in the diaspora and say, your first responsibility is to the lads back home. Well, my experience of Chinese Australians and Chinese Americans, they have a much more complex view of the world than that. But there can be a level of presumption on the part of the Chinese authorities, as reflected by my Jiang Zemin example, which says that, but hang on, your first loyalty is back home. And in our system of laws, that's not the case. Where you choose to be a citizen, that's where your first loyalties lie. For me, one of the great things that I noticed toward the end of my period in office, when I started meeting Australian non-commissioned officers who were Chinese Australians, when I was out at West Point, meeting Chinese-speaking officers out there who are Chinese Americans. It's really encouraging. So what are we going to do, repolarize the country and not allow that to happen? I think it's more complex than that. Be careful where we go.
All right, let's have some questions from you all. Please tell us who you are and make your questions brief. Let's start right here, and then we'll go back.
I work here as a volunteer and docent, and I'm very interested in China. Thank you for your comments, both of you. I have a question for whichever one of you chooses to answer. We have over 500,000 Chinese studying here in America this year, and we've had a lot in past years. When they go back, has anyone ever figured out how they feel about us, and does it have any effect at all back in China?
You know, my experience, and having been a dean at a big university, is that there has been something of a sea change, and each decade is slightly different, and actually each decade throughout the last century is slightly different. I think now, because the students who come here tend to be more in the sciences, computer programming, you know, engineering, business, law, these kinds of things, there is less of a transmission of sort of core civic values and basic sort of humanism that you might be imparted through history, literature, poetry, philosophy. So I think that there tends to be less transmission of those kinds of valuative things. And thus, there tends to be, I've noticed, much greater levels of sort of nationalism than at earlier periods in the interaction between China and the West.
One footnote to that is that there have been recent changes in American visa law, as I understand, as it relates to Chinese students here in the United States. If you've previously been a Chinese student doing a first degree, then you'd normally get an extra 2 years to stay. Now I'm advised the change is you only get 1 year to stay unless you're doing a STEM subject in the sciences, technology, and the rest. If that is the case, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm advised that's the case, then you begin to see automatically why you would have an increased skewing of Chinese students in the direction of, let's call it, the hard sciences or the applied sciences. And my own anecdotal experience is that as China actually has become wealthier, and you've got a whole bunch of students rolling around countries like yours and ours, is that for the first time I've seen more appetite for students studying the humanities, not the hard sciences. But if there's a structural factor which says to stay and to have a chance of working here, you've got to study the STEM subjects. Well, frankly, if I was a Chinese student, that's what I'd do too. So I think it's a complex reality. Have we ever tried to analyse the views of America or Australia or the West that Chinese students take back? I take a general view that the more Chinese students study in our countries, the better. They discover all of our strengths and all of our weaknesses and understand that we actually manage to hold these things together still in something we call a liberal democracy. All our differences, all our disagreements. And I think that for many of our Chinese friends remains the continuing marvel of the West. That whether you voted for Trump or whether you didn't, Trump's time will eventually go.
Right back here.
My name is Dr. Robert Luster. I'm a retired history professor from Nassau Community College. It appears that a trade war between the United States and China is inevitable. And what I'd like to ask the Prime Minister is, how precarious is Australia's position if there is a full-blown trade war between the United States and China? And what's Malcolm Turnbull going to do about it? That's my question.
Well, I think, first of all, the $6,000 question is, will there be one? We're still on the countdown. I think the hardheads on both sides are seeking desperately to avoid it. What we're now working out is what is the transaction price to so avoid it, and so that everyone gets to preserve some political face at the end of the day. Trump wants a $200 billion change in the bilateral trade deficit. How much will the Chinese bid on that? My latest advice is they'll bid $70 billion, but not a dollar more, thank you very much, and throw in a fix for ZTE on the way through. So is that going to be the alchemy of the deal? Is that going to be the art of the deal? Or will that be the undoing of the deal? I don't know. So I'm cautious enough to actually hold judgment. So the second part of your question would be the hypothetical. Let's assume that it does end up with either a limited or more general trade war, not just in aluminium and steel, but also into other product areas as well, like the second list which the Trump administration is preparing. I think the real danger is this. It's not so much the quantity of the restrictions which set in, but if we're trying to look at the history of the world economy in 5 years' time and ask us, when did the great new protectionism start and when did the age of free trade end? If this becomes, as it were, a piece of, let's call it, more generalized contagion, which legitimizes protectionist policies more generally in the world, and not just the Chinese responses, but also the European responses and the Canadian responses and the Mexican responses. What freaks me out, frankly, is that we enter into a completely new paradigm, which I haven't seen for decades, because we concluded a long time ago that free trade, arbitrated through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which you guys in the United States came up with back in 1944, we now call it the WTO, was actually, given the global economic history, probably the best we could ever do. And secondly, it created a set of norms around the world, which we built on in Asia through APEC and other such regional innovations, which said this should be the norm. And as a result, all boats have risen on a rising tide through global free trade. That has been how we produced the economic miracles of East Asia. So what I worry about is whether if we look back on these events, it's not the intrinsics of how much aluminium, how much steel, or how many products, and it was at 50, 70 or 90 billion. It's frankly the overall change in the normative framework which says that free trade era is over. We're now into an age of new protectionism. That is the new norm. Everyone start preparing their own measures. That will collapse growth. So my answer, as a country which is about 40% of its GDP is trade dependent, and this country is 27% the traded sector of the economy, then that's going to flow back through into people's living standards. So it might not be popular these days, but I'm kind of a centre-left free trade guy who actually thinks it's the best thing that's going for working people around the world.
You know, I think the part that Trump gets right about the trade situation is the fact that things are really out of balance. And we have really not attended to that. And I think the Chinese actually missed some very good chances under Obama when there was a much more level-headed leadership to restore a certain balance to the trade relationship. But it didn't happen. They weren't pushed hard enough, and they didn't offer it. Now they have Trump. Trump gets the disruption just fine. He understands something's wrong. How do you put it back together again? That's the part he's not so good at. And that's where I have very sort of dark fears that once you get a rip in the balloon, I mean, this thing could go down very quickly. You get these retaliatory sort of episodes, and we may be right on the edge of one. They may arrest it, but it has all the hallmarks of it could easily just get escalating. Okay, and the aisle back there, the man.
I'm a former business executive in Asia. Thanks for the marvelous high-level, civilizational level comments. A practical question, Korea, we haven't mentioned so far. China's attitude toward reconciliation between North and South. Is there a split between South Korea and America? Is there pressure for American troops to be withdrawn? Is there an agenda in that direction? How far is China interested in enforcing severe sanctions if things go south in the future? Just a few questions.
I'm going to be very unorthodox here and throw the microphone to Danny Russell, my deputy, because he's the point man on this. Danny.
Danny, stand up so people can actually watch you.
Well, I'll join the questioner in commending you both on civilizational level discussion on China and on values. I thought it was very useful and very interesting. I think the starting premise in answering a question like this is to stipulate that China's approach to issues of the Korean Peninsula is first and foremost going to be built around China's own strategic interests. It is not an altruistic equation. It's a very pragmatic and self-interested equation, and I think it's fair to say that all the indications are that China, while it opposes a nuclear North Korea, cares most about preventing war and chaos on China's own border. And so a scenario, even if it is highly uncomfortable to the United States, in which North Korea is able to bob and weave and maintain some nuclear capability, but in a much less threatening posture, is probably an outcome that China feels that it can live with. Moreover, a situation in which China can't reasonably calculate the actions of the United States, where it's faced with a series of unpredictable zigs and zags, where it's blindsided and in many cases, or in some cases thus far, actually embarrassed and humiliated, such as when the White House hosted the visiting National Security Advisor of South Korea, Chung Eui-yong, who announced utterly without consultation with China, with Xi Jinping, that President Trump intended to meet with Kim Jong-un. I think you'll see China that hedges considerably and pulls back from both the level of consultation and cooperation with Washington, and also pulls back from the application of stringent and tough sanctions. We saw not only the remarkable screeching U-turn where Xi Jinping went from holding Little Kim Fatty III, as the Chinese like to call him, at arm's length, if not by the scruff of the neck, to opening his arms in an extraordinarily warm embrace when Kim Jong-un was welcomed in Beijing, first with a level of pomp and circumstance that came pretty close to what Donald Trump himself enjoyed, and then a remarkable follow-on second summit in Dalian, right near the Sino-North Korean border. So this is clearly a very dynamic situation, but it's one in which we are probably looking at a return to a relationship between China and North Korea that looks a lot more like lips and teeth than the sort of tough love that we were seeing from Beijing in the latter half of 2017.
You know, I worry that in this meeting, because Trump is so hungry for a victory, he will create the appearance that there is a good settlement by just delaying everything. And he's already started to lay the groundwork for that. And actually, we'll get very little, except he and Kim Jong-un will waltz off out of Changi Airport looking like close personal friends. And I think that's his payback, and that's what he wants. But it doesn't mean the issues are settled. Okay, right over here.
Hello, hello everyone. My name is Andrea Yue. I'm partner at EY, Ernst Young, and I'm in charge of the China tax desk for North Americas. To make you understand a little bit easier, that I'm in charge of the U.S. and the Canada companies to do business in China. So I just wondering, Prime Minister, so you know that U.S. has the tax reforms. And what do you think about the China economy in the future years? And what do you think about the U.S. investment? Do you think that a lot of U.S. companies will make the cash to pay cash back to U.S., or you think that maybe they will keep cash in China and make more investment in China, or they think maybe U.S. is a better market? This is my first question. And
Let's have one.
Can I just go to that one?
Okay.
Thank you. That one's, what do I think about the Chinese economy? That's another half an hour. So one point about the Chinese economy and one point about, let's call it, Chinese foreign exchange policy. Chinese economy, I think those of us who look at it closely, as we do at the Asia Society Policy Institute, raise a number of flags, red flags, about the pace and direction of China's next phase of market economic reforms. These were announced in great fanfare in 2012, 2013, and frankly, in our analysis 5 years later, we would give China probably about a 2 out of 10 pass mark in the implementation of their own next wave market-based reforms. This is not us applying an external benchmark as to what we think China should do. The benchmark we apply is what China decided it needed to do and back in 2013 in state-owned enterprise reform, in competition policy reform, foreign trade reform, foreign investment reform, as well as fiscal reform, financial system reform, education reform, environment reform, land reform, and labour reform. I've missed one. There's 10 altogether. If you go through them and what China set out as its blueprint, there's something about the political economy of China in the last 5 years which has caused this to slow down significantly. Whether it's been the anti-corruption campaign, whether it's been the reassertion of the role of the party over individual firms, whether it's been other factors concerned with China's external economic environment, I'm not sure. But I think we need to look very carefully at what now happens that Xi Jinping is back for a second term, decisively so, given his change to term limits as well, about whether in fact the new economic leadership of the country is going to take this blueprint and implement it. Why do I raise that? Because if they don't, then we need to raise question marks about China's medium-term growth performance. Because it just doesn't happen magically. You can't just bank on reforms done 10, 15, 20 years ago. Economic reform is a never-ending process. That's my overall cautionary note about the Chinese economy. And secondly, on foreign exchange policy and the concerns which have been exhibited by a number of American firms, but also Chinese firms seeking to have capital to deploy outside the country as well. I think China's level of capital controls have been loosened somewhat, but if you look carefully at the directives given to the People's Bank of China and to SAFE, the State Foreign Exchange Administration, there are still significant, let's call it administrative controls at work, which make the free operation of capital flows in one direction or the other, China to the US, China to the US, as being problematic. And so I think it does represent a continuing area of risk.
I think we have time for one more question. Did you have a question? Or
I did.
Oh, please.
You had talked about...
Here's the microphone.
Thank you. You had talked about the forces indigenous to China and those new. Could you elaborate some of each category?
There's a great civilizational question to end the evening with, which is the forces of change at work in China, those which are indigenous to the tradition and those which are external or new, which we don't see alive in the tradition. I'm sure Orville, who's got a wry look on his face, will correct whatever I say here, so he will get the last laugh. I think within the tradition, applying to the China of the 21st century, the forces at work are as follows. One, in the Chinese tradition, it's almost impossible to find a political precedent for anything which would approach a liberal democratic form of government, and therefore enables the Chinese Communist Party to say that China has always been an authoritarian state. Now, there are gradations of that argument in history. There are certainly different traditions of dissent within Chinese history. And then there's the great experimentation of the nationalist period in the 30s, interrupted by the Japanese occupation. But that is a huge mainstay in the tradition, the way in which they view politics. The second is, and it reinforces the first, but also I think it's important to understand Chinese views of the world, is that if there is one term in the Chinese tradition or concept in the Chinese tradition which people find galvanizing, is that 别搞乱, which is we don't want chaos, don't produce chaos. Chinese history teaches us that whenever it's been chaotic in the past, everyone suffers. Wars happen, famines happen, everything else happens. And we don't particularly care what the political system is, to a certain extent, so long as we don't have chaos. That reinforces the first point. It's also a comforting point. That overstates it. It's a relevant point for those beginning to think about what China's requirements would be if it sought to change the global order. China does not, unlike other countries in the world, have an interest in global chaos. China has an interest in global order. They do have an interest in what sort of order, but they'd much prefer order, any order, than no order at all. And that is an extension, I think, to the international worldview of the Chinese, which comes out of their domestic tradition. So I think that's a second and deeply relevant factor as well. The third is, I think, the deep historical Chinese reverence in the tradition for education and coming out of education, but separate to it, enterprise. Both are irrepressible in the Chinese tradition. They are alive and well, and you see it through Confucian work ethic, the intensity of study, and the application which Chinese students and others bring to bear in the world at large. And when enterprise it's given its head, as it has been with companies like Alibaba and the rest, you see what happens. So these are big live elements within the tradition, which are there pushing in various directions, one way or the other. In terms of external to the tradition, which are now factors which are washing over the Chinese system domestically, the one that I would emphasize most of all is the sheer disruptive effect within China of technology itself. We seem to think, and we often conclude, that it is potentially a great source of comfort to authoritarian regimes to have an ability to use the new technologies to control local populations. And there is truth in that. But there is a counter-truth as well, which is that it's just so inherently disruptive that you'll find communities of public opinion in China springing up all over the place. However often you try to control Chinese Weibo, Chinese Twitter, well, frankly, it's still not ultimately controllable. If you look at Chinese WeChat, yes, it's accessible to the Chinese security services, but there's a huge WeChat conversation which rolls on about whether Xi Jinping abolishing term limits was a good thing or not. And so all that is out there, courtesy of the new technologies, together with those technologies which add your ability to control the state as well. The second, I think, big factor from the outside, which is again disruptive, is China now looks at the impact of the automation and the AI revolution with both alarm and opportunity as well. We're a country of 1.4 billion people. We have a workforce of 700 million people. You're about to tell me we're going to have driverless cars? What's that mean for our workforce? What does it mean for people who work in the number 16 sock factory, let alone the number 2 glue factory? So this is as much a cause for concern as it is for China at the highest levels of its political apparatus saying, hang on, we'll take the commanding heights of this by investing 2% of GDP to beat those goddamn Americans at their own game. And that's at work as well. And so my big answer to your question, I think, in terms of the external factors, are technology. And the final one is still the power of ideas. And when, as I said, those of us who come from a tradition of the West and believe in concepts of freedom, when Chinese systems choose to describe themselves as democratic, in Chinese, minzhu, it's because they know there's an inherent ethical value in the concept of something called democratic. Even the North Koreans use the term Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And that's therefore means that there is an instinctive, shall I say, anxiety about the potency of the idea of freedom kicking around, which can never be, as it were, just neatly, easily, shall I say, semantically dismissed. And because when Chinese folks come to this country, for all of its faults, the United States of America, there are huge virtues and in its public culture which have their organizing principle around either political or economic freedom or cultural freedom. These speak powerfully to systems around the world, including China. Look at what Mohammed bin Salman's now doing in Saudi. He's aware of the same forces for change with his young people. And so don't underestimate the power of ideas as well, and particularly those associated around the kernel of the idea, what we call freedom. One final point. Footnote for the evening. I just saw my good friend Frank Brennan here. Frank's an Australian Jesuit, and who's just arrived in New York about 2 hours ago, and he just quietly nodded off before in the middle of my remarks. But he's a friend, and I forgive him for that, and he's a priest, and he's got to forgive me. So he doesn't have a choice. The other really interesting factor in China, which none of us can actually put a handle on, is what's going to happen with religion in China. We often don't put this into our analysis. Buddhism is huge and growing across China. And with all of its wonderful humanitarian teachings alive within the tradition. Christianity is growing, both Protestant and Catholic, and in different ways. If you go to, for example, Zhejiang and see the rise of Protestant churches and the reaction of the authorities to those Protestant churches, it's a phenomenon to observe. And so there is something happening in sort of the religious sentiment of the country which you cannot push to one side either in our overall analysis. Is that domestic? Is it foreign? Is it within the tradition? Is it not? Well, it's all of the above.
And it's worth noting that the fundamental impulse of religion is highly individual. It's a relationship of a human being to their God or to their code of ethics. And in that sense, it can be quite subversive. You know, just one final very short thought. I share Kevin's sentiment that one of the great sort of worries of any Chinese regime throughout history has been this idea of disassembly, of chaos, of things falling into just collapsing, end of dynasty. And of course the antidote to that, whether you're a good Confucian or a good Leninist, is control. And control is the antithesis of freedom. So you have to worry a little bit that if there's a toolbox with just that set of tools in it, more control, things can get wound up very tightly. And I have to say, not predicting anything here, and I stand in awe of China's success, but the 20th century, the 19th century, after the Enlightenment, after the end of the divine right of kings and royalty ruling Europe, we haven't had a lot of examples of authoritarian governments that have really proved very durable. It's just worth bearing in mind if, as a historian, as I am, you're always looking for the next chapter.
More importantly, tonight I hope you all got one of my chocolate bars.
I have said chocolate bar in my pocket.
I was once a politician, so this is just egregious self-promotion. But anyway, no, it's because we're launching my book here tonight, part one of my autobiography, Not for the Faint-Hearted, but here is Kevin Rudd, Not for the Faint-Hearted chocolate bar, and on the back, not the thoughts of Mao, but the thoughts of Kevin. It says, "My name's Kevin, I'm from Queensland, and I'm here to help." And so, free from us at the Asia Society. No, actually, I paid for it myself. I hope you enjoy the chocolate.
I recommend that Kevin get lapel pins like Kim Jong-un, but so far we've not evolved to that higher state of being. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and congratulate Kevin on his new book.